In this lesson, we are continuing our discussion of Russia and its rulers, specifically the impact of wars and revolutions on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, focusing in this lesson on the 1905 revolution. Now, we spoke briefly about the 1905 revolution in the previous lesson when we talked about the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War was one of the major factors of consequence, essentially that causes the 1905 revolution. And so we spoke a little bit about the 1905 revolution in that regard. This lesson is going to examine it in far more detail today. We're going to begin with the background and causes. There are three main causes that I've cited here in my notes. The first of these is the fact that there was general economic hardship and social inequality. By the early 1900s, we can see cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow growing in terms of their size and in terms of their prestige, but because industrialization was uneven, many areas within rural Russia remained very, very impoverished. The working class in the cities lived under appalling conditions. Additionally to this, they had long working hours, they had low wages, they had poor working conditions, and we see that there are struggles by peasants as the result of, heavy taxation, and agrarian reforms of the late 19th century had not significantly improved. We also see that in addition to this, there is a sense of political repression. The Tsar at the time was Nicholas II, the final Tsar of Russia. Nicholas was the final Tsar of the Romanov dynasty as well. And he ruled with absolute power. And political opposition political opposition to autocracy was severely suppressed. The Tsarist regime was inflexible, and it was out of touch with the emerging demands of political reform. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, was viciously repressing any forms of dissent. You have to remember that ever since Nicholas I and Nicholas II, there have been revolutionary ideas. Nicholas II famously was assassinated by a revolutionary movement, by an anarchist movement. There were anarchists and Marxist and socialist groups that were starting to gain ground, and many intellectuals and workers were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the autocratic system. And then finally, of course, Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War had severe consequences for the Tsarist regime, as you can probably imagine. The war was a disaster for Russia. It undermined the Tsar's authority, and it further aggravated the economic and social tensions. And so from here, we get the outbreak of the revolution. It begins in earnest on the 22nd of January 1905. With Bloody Sunday, when a peaceful procession of workers and their families, led by Father Gapton, marched to the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. They essentially went to try and present a petition to the Tsar. It was a peaceful protest. It was a peaceful, not even really a protest, a petition. The demonstrations sought for reforms. They wanted some better working conditions. They wanted to do 8-hour workdays, and they wanted some political rights. The result, however, is that the Tsar's soldiers opened fire on the crowd and killed hundreds of people, and it was an event that shocked the nation and sparked much broader and wider and widespread unrest. And so following Bloody Sunday, we get the spread of the revolution. Strikes, protests, and uprisings spread across Russia. Workers, peasants, and even soldiers in the army began to rebel, some of which events included the general strikes. Major industrial cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow experienced large-scale strikes, workers demanding better working conditions. In the countryside, there was peasants revolting against their landowners and the government, demanding land redistribution and better working conditions. These uprisings were often brutal, and the government responded very harshly, but they were also indicative of broader discontent. A further consequence, a further piece of significance, was the establishment, the formation of the Soviets. In some cities, workers began to organize themselves into councils that are called Soviets, and these Soviets started to play an important role in the revolution. The most famous of this was the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies. Essentially, the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies brought together workers, intellectuals, and radicals who sought to push for more significant reforms. Now, keep in the back of your mind the role and the impact of the Soviets and things like the St. Petersburg Soviet, because we will get to them in more detail, because they become a very key institution in the 1917 revolutions. So, what really were the aims of the revolution? Well, some historians argue that the revolution was aimed to overthrow Tsar Nicholas II. And if that was the case, then it did not succeed. Nicholas II stayed and remained in power. He would stay until he abdicates in 1917. But it did still nevertheless force him to make concessions. The Tsar initially attempted to crush the uprisings through brutal repression, but eventually he came to the realization that he needed to offer some actual reforms in order to appease the populace, in order to retain his power. These reforms begin with the October Manifesto that was issued on the 17th of October 1905. This is a manifesto which promised a number of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, assembly, and association. It sought to establish a constitutional monarchy and to establish a legislative assembly. A legislative assembly would be essentially a body that would make law, like a legislature, which is like, for example, Parliament in the UK or Congress in America. These are legislatures. They create laws, they create legislation. So that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to establish a Duma. Now, the manifesto was a direct response to the demands for political reform, and it aimed to diffuse the revolutionary crisis. And so while many liberals and moderates saw it as a major step towards this idea of constitutionalism, it still left most, if not all, of the power in the hands of the Tsar. The creation of the Duma then was finalized. In theory, the legislative body could challenge the Tsar's authority. However, in reality, the Tsar retained the power to dissolve the Duma whenever he so chose, and it became clear that the Duma had very little authority. And so, especially in subsequent years, Tsar Nicholas II and his advisors would essentially just manipulate the Duma to ensure that it did not challenge the autocracy seriously. So, generally speaking, the October Manifesto looked like on its face, a good faith approach to trying to deal with the situation. But in reality, it didn't really do anything of major significance, because the October Manifesto, while promising civil liberties, while promising a constitutional monarchy, while promising the establishment of a Duma, did establish a Duma, but had one that had no authority, and while promising a constitutional monarchy, essentially maintained the rule of autocracy. Despite the reforms, the Tsar's regime still remained committed to the use of brutal repression to crush uprisings and to maintain control. The army was often mobilized and used to quell protests, and the secret police forces still continued to monitor revolutionary activities. So those were the immediate reforms, or the immediate responses to the to the 1905 revolution. At the very least, it showed that the Tsar could not get his own way, because ideally the Tsar would have just used brutal repression to get rid of and quell any kind of rebellion. He had to, at the very least, use piecemeal appeasement to try and get the people who are angry and who are revolting against the Tsar to back down. And so even if they were on their face a good idea, and in reality they maintained autocracy, it at the very least showed a weakening of the Tsar's authority. The revolution significantly weakened his authority because it heightened the vulnerability of the autocratic system. He was unable to restore complete control over Russian society, and the promises that were made in the October Manifesto did create some expectations that were not fully met. Essentially, we also see that this is a rise of revolutionary movements that leads to a almost prelude to the 1917 revolutions in February and in October, it laid the groundwork for revolutionary movements in the future among the workers, the peasants, and the intellectuals. Radical groups such as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks gained support from the dissatisfaction generated by the 1905 revolution, and the failure to essentially do anything major in terms of the October Manifesto or the establishment of a Duma would continue to just radicalize more and more people. It contributed to the rise of political ideologies such as Marxism, socialism, and anarchism within Russia. It also highlighted the growing gap between the ruling elite and the masses, which would become a central issue of later revolutionary movements. So we get the Marxist movements, we get the socialist movements, we get the anarchist movements. The creation of the Duma was initially a step forward towards constitutionalism, but like I said earlier on, still fundamentally failed to bring any kind of meaningful democratic reform. The Tsar continued to manipulate it, its powers were very limited, and they were unable to address the underlying problems that were facing Russians in Russian society. The Duma would still maintain this sort of the ire of a desire for reform, the idea of reform in reality, but its existence became a point of contention because the Tsar could essentially do what he wanted with it. He could dismiss it and call it whenever he so chose, a bit like the monarchs of the medieval times, for example. And this ultimately leads to the prelude and sets the stage for the prelude of the revolution of 1917. It did not directly lead to the overthrow of the Tsar, like I said, but the February Revolution of 1917 does. This does lead to the overthrowing of the Tsar and the establishment of the dual power structure with the Petrograd Soviet on the one hand and the provisional government on the other. The failure of the Duma to bring significant change and the continued economic hardship all essentially create problems that are sort of bubbling up under the surface, which, when you add a catalyst like something such as the First World War, will lead to the revolutions that we see in 1917, which will be the topic, by the way, of the next two lessons.